Welcome, and thanks for joining me in this first of three parts of a Bible study known as Foundations. In this instance, we're going to take a look at the Bible overall, basically a 30,000-foot view, if you will. So many of us have read the scriptures. Maybe you've read the whole thing from start to finish. Maybe you've done it piecemeal. Maybe you're doing it in the chronological fashion as we are doing here at Westside this year. But sometimes it's hard to put the stories together, to know who belongs where and when did things take place in relationship to one another. And what are the parts of these stories that are key and essential to the overall arching story of God's relationship with God's people? Well, that is our intent in this particular study. And in this first session, we're going to look at the story from creation to the post-exilic period, basically the entire Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament, or what is also known as the Hebrew Bible, is made up of 39 books. So that's a lot of material to cover, but we're going to do the best that we can because, again, high level view. To help you along with this, I would recommend that you download a copy of our first handout for this session, known as Foundations Session 1, Creation to Post-Exile. You'll see on the front that there's a map, and on the back there's some additional maps. Those are for your use and to help you locate where things are taking place. But in the center then is a rather involved timeline that you can fill in with names, places, and events that take place and that are mentioned as part of our scripture story. And as we go through this session, I will point them out. I'll give you the names. You can fill those in as you like. The second handout that will be useful throughout all three parts of our study is called Foundations Maps. And if you pull it open, if you have it on 11 by, if you're able to print it on 11 by 17, that's really helpful. The outside is a map of what is known as the Fertile Crescent, going from Italy all the way over to what we nowadays call the Persian Gulf. Inside, then, are two additional maps, one of the Promised Land, Israel, or Canaan, as depending on the time period, and the city of Jerusalem. And again, we'll pause at times to allow you to fill in where some of the critical and important places are mentioned in that. So I hope you'll continue to join us, and I hope you'll find this valuable. But we're going to start off this first session by doing a little pretest. And so again, you can download this and do this at your will. We have a timeline. It mentions different periods within the Old Testament storyline, from creation to which is part primeval history and patriarchal history, to the forming of the nation, to the United Kingdom, to the divided monarchy, ultimately into exile and then post-exile. And I've given you a list of 24 names. I'd like you to, as best you can, put them in order on the timeline. How well do you know when these events and these people lived during these events? So if you will, go ahead and pause the video at this point, download the pretest if you haven't already, take that, and then resume, and let's see how we do as we go through this beginning portion of our story, Foundations, Creation to Post-Exile. Now that you had an opportunity to test out your knowledge, and it's always a good idea to sort of pre-test to get an idea of where you are at this time, and then post-test, do it again afterwards to see how much you've learned in between. And that's what our goal is. And so here I have the list of 24 individuals that were listed in the pre-test. And as we go through our timeline, we're going to see how well you did at placing them appropriately on the timeline that's before us. Now, before we go to the timeline and we start the actual bulk of this particular class, I want to point out to you that above the timeline, we have a listing of books that are found in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible as it's also known. Now, in these instances, we know that trying to read the Old Testament can be incredibly difficult because it starts off really well with narrative in Genesis, and we got lots of good stories, ones that we're very familiar with. We move into Exodus, and again, lots of good stories. And then about Exodus 20, that's where we get the Ten Commandments. Thereafter, the rest of the book of Exodus is a lot of information about building the tabernacle in great detail, as well as the furniture that's part of it, and some of the basics of worship. And we start to get slogged down in our reading when we start from Genesis move forward. Well, the reason being is that the narrative portions that tell us about the history and movement of the Hebrew people are not found back to back to back within the book. And instead, these are the books that contain the narrative aspects of Hebrew history. In between, we have other books, and I need to do a shout out to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Sid Buzzell, whose video course introduced me to the concept of what he would call color books. And in this instance, what we would find is that when we read through Genesis, we get story. When we get to Exodus, we get story. And in Exodus, part of the story is that God gives the people the commands. And so the next book is Leviticus. And this is what Dr. Buzzell would call a color book, because it colors in the details of what happened in our narrative. But it breaks up the flow of the story. If we skip over Leviticus and go into Numbers, well, we also have to skip a couple of chapters that talk about census and how many people there were and how many in each clan, but we also get more of this narrative story. The next book, of course, is then Deuteronomy, which again stops the story aspect of it because it's another color book. It's at the end of Moses' life when he gives a series of 5 sermons to remind the people of where they've been and where God has taken them throughout their history thus far. And therefore, it's a coloring in what were the speeches that Moses had given, and so on and so forth. So today in this session, we're really just going to be focusing on the narrative that are found in these particular books. On your handout, you'll notice that above the timeline, you have actually 3 rows of those books. The one that's closest to the timeline are those that are of the narrative. The one above it, those are the color books. And then above that, we have the books of wisdom and prophecy. So that's just trying to give you a little bit of explanation. So let's go ahead and start the bulk of the story by going to creation. And so we read in Genesis 1:1 and on into Genesis 2 about how God created all of everything that we know. The people that are involved there are, of course, Adam and Eve. They are the first 2 humans that are given names that we know of. In creation, we see all of God's great love pouring into the world and into creating people in God's own image. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any timeline here to tell us how long or how short it might have been, but then the Adam and Eve characters, they are left alone in the beautiful Garden of Eden, and they are encountered by the snake, by the serpent, who immediately manages to instill distrust and doubt in God. And it's there that Adam and Eve decide that maybe they can't trust God and they need to take some of this ownership of their lives on themselves, and they take that forbidden fruit. At that point, we have the fall. This, of course, requires that God, who is holy, needs to force them away because he can't abide by what is unholy and sinful. And we get the stories of their children, Cain and Abel and Seth. And we see generation after generation as each of these peoples are given the opportunity to either choose God or not. They seem to get slowly and slowly, or maybe not so slow, but every succeeding generation gets worse than the last, until finally the world is corrupt and evil, and God can't abide by it, and so he decides to start afresh. He's going to flood the earth, destroy all that was created, and restart. And he picks a man by the name of Noah and his family to populate the earth. Now, even from the beginning of that, Noah was a man after God's desires and followed God, but even he was not perfect. And we see almost immediately after the flood story that this family starts to fall apart. And that continues into the Tower of Babel story that is found there. And so what we see is that in this beginnings section, this what's known as primeval history. There's no timelines around it, and God is focusing on the world as a whole. But after the Tower of Babel, it's really apparent that this isn't working. And so God decides instead that God's going to work through a single family. At this point, we switch from primeval history to what's known as patriarchal history because it follows the male heirs that go through this particular story. The first that we see is Abram and his wife Sarai. Now, they are called from Ur. And if you look on your map, you can see here where Ur is located. But God calls out to Abram and his wife and says, "Go to this land which I will show you." Now, that takes a lot of faith. If you haven't thought about that, and some people I know have never moved more than just even a few miles from their childhood home, the idea of moving to someplace where they don't know anybody, anything, the language, the customs, to leave everything that's familiar behind seems incredibly difficult. And it is. But here, Abram and Sarai are called by this God and said, "Come to the land which I will show you." And an incredible act of faith for which Abraham is commended, even back in the book of Hebrews, found in our New Testament, as a man of faith. He indeed takes Sarai, his wife, and they go to what is the land of Canaan. Now, Abraham, as his name is eventually changed to, and Sarai, who becomes Sarah, have no children of their own. And that is one of the greatest desires, particularly in this era when, and even now, you find a lot of families, they want children because they want to pass along their name. They want to live forever in their family, family that continues beyond them. And that's the case here as well. But Abraham and Sarah are quite elderly. And God calls and creates a covenant with Abraham. Now, this covenant is important because it becomes the basis for a lot of what takes place, not just in the Old Testament, but even going into the New. And so we want to point that out. Now, this covenant, which is an agreement between God and people, in this case specifically Abraham and his descendants, is not the first. There was, in fact, a covenant at the time of the flood that God promised never to destroy the earth again by water. So that was one of the first covenants. Well, this covenant with Abraham is particularly important to keep in mind. And so we're going to write this down, covenant. And this covenant had 3 parts. The first part was about family. In this, God promised that Abraham and Sarah would have more descendants than sand on the seashore or stars in the sky. Well, as I mentioned earlier, they were already quite elderly. And much like Adam and Eve at the beginning of our story, when we talk about the fall, they started to doubt whether or not God was going to come through on this promise, or if maybe they needed to help out the situation. And here we see the story where Sarai gives Abram her maidservant, Haggai, all of a sudden I'm forgetting her name, and she has a son, Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the son of promise. And so even though he does become a great nation in and of himself, it's not through him that Abraham will receive the results of this covenant. And instead, God waits until there's absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that it wasn't Abraham or Sarah that made this happen. They were well beyond the age of bearing children when God gifts them with this miracle child. And the miracle child is Isaac. His name, in fact, means laughter, because Sarah laughed at the idea that she would be able to have a son at her old age. But God often waits and works miracles when it becomes apparent that it has to be God, because it's nothing that a human being could have done on their own. And so what we see is that Abraham does indeed have an heir, And while Abraham will not see in his lifetime all of his descendants, he does see the start of it with Isaac. And so we know, of course, that that family will grow, and we'll address that again as the time comes. The second part of the covenant that God makes with Abraham is about the land. In this case, from the very beginning, when God called him in Ur, he has promised him to go to a land that I will show you, God says. And in this case, Abram is taken to the land of Canaan. And again, we can find this located on our maps to get an idea of some perspective there. But for the entire time of Abraham's life, Abraham will live as a nomad and a stranger and foreigner in that land. Again, within his lifetime, he will never see the time when he owns the land, other than one small cave where he will bury Sarah when she dies. It's the only part of that he will own. And so again, it will be many generations later before we see this aspect of the covenant fulfilled. Now, the third part of the covenant is that Abraham's progeny, descendants, will become a great nation, and that all the nations of the world will be blessed through his family. So blessing is the third part. We're going to address the blessing portion of this covenant a little bit later, but it's again a three-part covenant of which Abraham really doesn't see any of them come to fulfillment. But as we're told in Hebrews, he's a great man of faith, and so he believes what God says, even though he doesn't get to see it for his own with his own eyes. Well, indeed, Abraham and Sarah do have a son, Isaac. Isaac will go on to marry Rebekah, and Rebekah will have twins. The first one, and the one that is probably the best known, is Jacob. He's actually the younger son. He has a twin brother named Esau. Now, Esau has a lot to do with this story because it tells us how Jacob, the younger son, ended up becoming the next person in the patriarchy. In fact, Esau, who was a hunter, comes in one day and he's famished. And Esau has just made a pot of red lentil stew, and Esau wants some, and Jacob, who's a little bit of a conniver, he agrees to give him some if he will give up his birthright. Now, it's important to understand birthright because it comes up quite frequently throughout Scripture. In this period of the biblical times, what we would see is that any family, depending on how many sons they have, yes, women were left out of this, surprise, surprise, but however many sons were in the family, the inheritance, whatever was left by the parent, by the father when he passed away, would be divided among the sons, but not evenly. If there were, for example, 4 sons, the property would be divided into 5, and the oldest son would get 2 portions. He would always get a double portion of each of his brothers. So in this case, Esau and Jacob, 2 sons, when Isaac were to die, his property would be divided into 3 parts. Esau would get 2/3 and Jacob would get 1/3. That was typical for oldest and youngest sons. Now in this instance, Jacob convinces Esau to give up his birthright. And so therefore, he's been cheated out of half of his inheritance, which will now go to his younger brother. And so you can see that there's some animosity going on between the brothers, even from the time that they're pretty young. Well, as Isaac ages and he gets older, his wife Rebekah, who favors Jacob, actually helps to convince and trick Isaac into giving Esau a blessing. And giving Jacob the blessing that is most deservedly to go to the oldest son, Esau. When Esau comes back and realizes this, he prays for more, for a blessing as well. And his father says, I have nothing left to give. And so we see that there's animosity. As a result, Jacob beats feet. He runs away for fear that his brother may actually kill him. And he ends up going to his uncle Laban. This would be his mother Rebekah's brother. When he's there, he falls in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel. And so he makes an agreement with Laban that he will work for 7 years in order to earn the right to marry his daughter Rachel. Well, the 7 years happens. He goes and has his wedding night, and he wakes up in the morning to realize that he didn't marry Rachel, but he actually married her older sister, Leah. Um, the trickster has been tricked. And Laban, the now uncle slash father-in-law, says, well, it's customary for us to marry the oldest daughter off first. And Jacob protests, and so Laban says, well, if you'll work for me another 7 years, I'll also give you Rachel. So he ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel. You can probably imagine that doesn't go too well. They each also have handmaidens. And what we end up seeing is that it is Leah, the older sister and the first wife, who ends up bearing children right away. She ends up having 3 or 4 sons, and this is a good thing for her because it should give her favor in the eyes of her husband. Rachel, on the other hand, her womb is barren, and in a desperate attempt to be able to have children for her husband, she gives him her handmaiden as a concubine. Before it's all said and done, Jacob is going to have 12 sons and 1 daughter that we know of named Dinah. So we can already see how the covenant promise for family is starting at this point. It's growing. Abraham's descendants are increasing. Eventually, Jacob will bring back his family to the land that was promised to his grandfather Abraham. That's where he knows he needs to be. And in trying to make peace with Esau, the night before, he spends and wrestles with the angel of God. As a result, God changes his name from Jacob to Israel, the name that we now know, the people of the Hebrew people, and the people of the promise. And so that's where the name Israel comes from. Well, as we mentioned, Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter, and there's stories to be told about many of them, but we're going to focus on Rachel's oldest son. Eventually, she was indeed allowed to have 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and the oldest one, Joseph, was favored by his father over all of the other children. Now, we know favoritism is not a good thing in families, and here we really see why. We know the story of the coat of many colors, but we also see that Joseph was given the ability to translate dreams. And he has a number of dreams which demonstrate that he will be in charge and that all of his brothers and sisters, as well as his parents, will bow to him. Now, I don't know if you have any siblings. I have a younger sister, and certainly if either of us had ever said, oh, I'm the favorite, or I'm the best, and you're going to have to bow to me, yeah, that would cause some problems. Well, it causes problems here, and Joseph is actually sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up getting sent to Egypt, and again, you can find that on your maps, and it's there. He's first sold into slavery. He does pretty well, but then he ends up getting thrown into prison. He does pretty well in prison, but ultimately this is where he gets called upon by Pharaoh to interpret a dream. When he interprets the dream, he shows that there's going to be a famine in the land. And the Pharaoh changes Joseph's name and lifts him up to be second in command of all of the nation, all of the empire, in order to create a plan so that this famine will not kill the nation. Well, in this new guise, and the famine having gone beyond the borders of Egypt, Joseph is reunited with his brothers, though they do not recognize him at first. Ultimately, though, everything works out, and Joseph invites, because he knows this famine is going to go on for many years, invites his father and his brothers and their families to move to Egypt, to the land of Goshen. Now, Goshen is in the northern part of Egypt. Again, we can see this on the map. There near where the Nile River Delta is. It's very fertile land, which is perfect for nomadic peoples who raise animals, such as Israel and his sons. Most of the Egyptians grow crops along the Nile where it overflows and is rich in silt, but they are seen as outsiders, and so they move to Goshen. And so what we find is when we end our reading of Genesis, 39 books, we've gotten through one so far, that the people have moved out of the promised land of Canaan and now are located in Egypt. The people are going to be there for a period of about 300 to 400 years, and we do not have any stories that take place during that time period. What we do know is that towards the end of their time in Egypt, a pharaoh comes to power who does not remember or know his history. He knows nothing about Joseph, and all he knows is that the 70 or so family members, Israel and Joseph and all the brothers and their spouses, who have come into the land, 70 people, are now numbering in the millions. And he sees them as a foreign people in the midst of his empire, and if he were to be attacked from the outside, he's concerned that these people would take the side of the attackers and attack them from within. In order to prevent that from becoming an issue, he enslaves the Hebrew people. And that's where the book of Exodus begins. In this instance, the people, now a nation worth of people, are crying out because they have been enslaved. And we can see the efforts that the new Pharaoh has taken in order to minimize the population by making sure that all the boy children who are born are killed. And of course, God provides means for which that won't happen. But one of those boy children, Moses, our next name, is saved from the debt or the edict of being drowned in the Nile River. Instead, his mother places him in the reed basket with pitch and tar, floats it down, and he is found by one of Pharaoh's daughters who adopts him. Now it's clear that he's a Hebrew baby, but nonetheless, he is adopted into the Egyptian Pharaoh's family. And so he grows up in what is at that time one of the richest and most advanced empires of history at that time. He would have grown up with all the splendors of Egypt, but also with the knowledge and education in astronomy and mathematics and all the things that the Egyptians knew. Well, when he reaches about 40 years old, he goes out among the people. He's never going to ascend to Pharaoh. He's an adopted son. But he goes out with the idea that he could help his people, the Hebrews. He comes across a Hebrew slave who is being beaten by one of his Egyptian masters. And so, in order to protect him, he murders the Egyptian overseer and buries his body in the sand. That seems to be the end of it, but the next day when he goes out, he sees two Hebrew slaves arguing with one another. When he goes to interfere, they say, "What are you going to do? Murder us." And it becomes apparent that his sin has become known. And so he does what anybody accused of murder probably ought to do, and he beats feet and he makes a run for it. He leaves Egypt and he ends up in the wasteland of Midian. And again, here on your map, you can see where Midian is to the east of not just Egypt, but across the Sinai Peninsula and into the southern part of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Well, he spends 40 years there. He ends up meeting a man by the name of Jethro, marrying one of his daughters, and for the next 40 years, he's a shepherd until God intervenes and Moses comes across the flaming bush. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning that and perhaps marking it in here as a reminder that this was one of the ways in which we start to see the story of Moses. Now, there are a number of events that are very critical in this time period and sort of act as a hinge on the Hebrew history. And so we see a lot of them in quick succession here in this first part of Exodus. Moses reluctantly agrees to be a leader. He goes back to Egypt. He's about 80 years old now. He goes and he confronts Pharaoh to let his people go. And of course, Pharaoh doesn't want to give up slave labor, and so he refuses. And so we have a series of what are known as miracles and signs, but what we most probably call them the 10 plagues. Now, what's interesting to be aware of is that these plagues, each of them are not just signs and wonders to show Pharaoh that God of the Hebrews is the one true God and the one who should be listened to, and therefore his people should be released so that they can go and worship him. But each of these signs and miracles also are a direct challenge to one of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Think for a moment about the one plague in which the land grew dark for 3 days. There was no sun. One of the main gods in the Egyptian pantheon is the god Ra, the god of the sun, who, the stories said, would in a chariot take the sun from the east to the west each day. Well, if the Hebrew God can prevent the sun from coming out for 3 whole days, then therefore he must be more powerful than Ra. And so it is that if we were to look in detail at each of these plagues, each one corresponds and challenges one of the gods that are found in the Egyptian pantheon. Now, of course, the last of the plagues is the death of the firstborn son, both in humans as well as cattle. And so God institutes a celebration that is still celebrated by Jews even today, known as the Passover. This is a fundamental event in the history of the Hebrews, and as I mentioned, it's even celebrated today, and so we see it mentioned over and over again throughout all of Scripture. This is the event in which God reached out, saved the Hebrews from losing their first children by offering the sacrifice of a perfect lamb. The blood then would be painted on the lintels of the door, and when the angel of death passed over, they would literally pass over those houses and not kill the firstborn. The Egyptians didn't hear, didn't know, and they lost a lot. And this is what breaks Pharaoh finally, and he says, fine, get out. As they get out, they not only escape, but they also manage to plunder the Egyptians by asking for gold and silver and precious things. Remember, they've been slaves for a period of time, and so when they leave Egypt, they go with their hands full and stuff that they're going to end up needing as the time goes by. So we have the Passover. Well, they managed to escape. They managed to make the trek. They're starting to head east, and they encounter the Red Sea. Well, about this time, Pharaoh comes to his senses and said, whoa, why did I let all that slave labor go? And so he, with his army of chariots, follows them. The people are now stuck between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. God again comes through and parts the Red Sea. As a result, the people are able to go through, the Egyptian army is drowned, and they are able to move on. They're going to move on to a place known as Mount Sinai. And it's here that God is going to give them first the 10 Commandments and then instructions for the tabernacle. And I want to point out the tabernacle because this is a moving worship space. It's sort of like being able to pick up your church and move it from one place to another. But more importantly, the tabernacle and its furniture, specifically the Ark of the Covenant, is the throne of God. It's the means by which God can live among God's people, because God wants to have relationship with us, wants to live with us, wants to be part of our everyday lives. And so the tabernacle is actually a very important aspect of not just the Hebrew Bible, but the story of who God is and how God wants to relate to us. And so here we are. As I mentioned earlier, this is where we get the 10 Commandments found in Exodus 20. Oh, sorry, using different colors. Want to make my colors consistent. 10 Commandments. And there's Numbers, or the book of Exodus. The end of Exodus then goes into detail about the building of the tabernacle. Well, now, if we skip over and jump into Numbers, and we move past the first few books that are about a census that was taken to count the number of people, we end up with stories about them finally, they take about a year at Mount Sinai. Now, think about this for a moment. As we've started out here, we had Abraham, we had Isaac, and then we had Jacob, or who is now known as Israel, and his family, about 70 people who go into Egypt during this period of time. By the time at the beginning of Exodus, they are now numbering in the millions. So we've gone from an extended family to a nation worth of people. And so forming a nation requires knowing how to lead and how to live together with that many people. And that's what the time spent at Mount Sinai is, about a year or so. It's not just about how to worship God, but it's also how to get along with one another and how to treat one another. And so we get a lot of the law in there. It's also God's way of setting apart this people from all the other nations and showing the nations what it means to be a people set apart for God. So we've got one of our three pieces of the covenant with Abraham finally met. The covenant with Abraham, the first one is family, more numerous than sand on the seashore and stars in the sky. We're numbering in the millions now here. So we've seen that first part actually done. So we could sort of check that off. That's done. Well, they still haven't taken possession of the land. After about a year at Mount Sinai, the people go up, they march north to the eastern bank of the Jordan River. And before they go in, Moses sends 12 spies, one from each of the tribes. Among them is a young man named Joshua. Joshua, Caleb, and 10 others whose names nobody ever remembers. Why aren't the others' names remembered? Because when they go and spy in the land, they come back and all of them say that, yes, God was right and God was faithful. This is a land of milk and honey and everything is beautiful and it's prosperous. Jacob and Caleb say, let's go ahead and take possession of the land. The other 10 say, wait, there are already people there and they're giants in comparison to us. We will never manage to succeed. Jacob and Joshua and Caleb say, God will give us the victory. The others say, no, it's too much. Because they're measuring themselves against these people. Whereas Joshua and Caleb are measuring the people against their God. And they know that God can succeed. But the others say no. And as a result, God says, fine, this generation not going in. And so this is where the beginning of the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years takes place. So that first generation will die off. And then God will allow the next generation to actually go into the promised land. And so Numbers gives us the stories about wandering through the wilderness. Now at the end of that period, Moses, who's been a great leader, he's approaching 120, he's had a couple rough spots when it comes to trusting God himself. And as a result, God has said, you're not going to go into the promised land. And so before he dies and before the people are ready to take possession, he gives a series of 5 sermons in the book that we know as Deuteronomy. After that, Joshua then becomes the leader of the Hebrew people. And in the book, by his name, Joshua, we actually see them go in and possess the land of Canaan. Now, it's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And God gives them the strategy by which they will manage to succeed. And they listen with some moderate success as they do or do not behave exactly as God intends. Well, how do they do this? First, they come up to the eastern bank of the Jordan, just above the Dead Sea, and they go in, and the first place that they encounter is Jericho, the great walled city. Jericho is in fact it is the oldest civilized place in the world. It has been the one place that is for the most amount of time had a human civilization. So Jericho is worth remembering, not only because of the story, but for its significance. Well, the city is fortified with a huge wall. The wall is so wide, in fact, that you could drive a chariot around the top. Now, the Israelites don't have chariots. These are nomads. They're not an army. And so they don't have a lot. And God calls for a strategy that seems rather out there. For 7 days, once a day, you're going to march around and then blow a horn. march around the city, blow the horn. Do that for 6 days. And on the seventh day, march around 7 times, blow the horn. And then God gives them the victory by pulling down the walls. And they're able to win the battle. Well, they also win over most of the promised land of Canaan by going in and doing a divide and conquer strategy. So they start with Jericho, move in and defeat the cities to the north before going to the cities of the south. And as I say, they do in fact win and take possession of most of the land. The reason why they don't take all of it is because they stop or they fail to obey God's commands. So we had Jericho here. And the land is ultimately divided between the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes are named after the sons of Jacob, now known as Israel, and they take possession. They take possession of homes and wells and fields and vineyards that were started by someone else until they came in and took possession. Now, at this point, we have that, again, now 2/3 of the Abrahamic covenant have been met. Family beyond stars in the sky, and now they've taken possession of the land. All that's left is for them to become a blessing to all the nations of the earth. But is that what they do? Well, obviously you've never read the story if you think that might be what happened. What we see in the next book, Judges, is in this period of time, the people of God settle into the land. But they find themselves, and again, this also comes about because they did not fully take the land as God had instructed them to do so, that they are surrounded by people and even have foreigners in their midst who worship other gods, who worship idols. And so their eyes become distracted away from the one true God to these idols. And when they fall away from the one true God, when they fall into idolatry, God allows them to be oppressed by a foreign people. When they cry out, God lifts up a leader among them known as a judge. The judge helps them to shake off the oppression, and during the rest of that particular judge's life, they do well. But as soon as that judge dies, it seems that their eyes get distracted again, and we see this cycle repeat over and over again. This cycle is known as the cycle of apostasy. Now, this is a big word you see in theology. If you don't remember it, that's fine, but cycle of apostasy. And what we see is that the book of Judges records how this happens over and over again. We have at least 12 named judges, and some of them may be familiar to you, and some of them unfamiliar. I'm just going to name 4 in particular. Ehud, and you may not know his name, but he's worth sharing that story with, I'd say, junior high kids. It's a really gross story, and they go, ooh, gross, but it gets them enthralled in these stories that are found in Scripture, so it's worth looking into in Judges chapter 3. But some of the other judges that you might know, Deborah, the only female judge who's mentioned, Gideon, who's famous nowadays as part of the organization Gideon Bibles, and probably the most famous, Samson. He of the long hair. The problem, though, is that just as we saw way back here, following both before and after the flood, is that each succeeding generation seems to get a little bit worse. They follow God less. Even the judges are less likely to believe or trust or follow God's commands. And so we see a decline in the overall society as a result. So much so that at the end of Judges, the author tells us, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. They didn't follow God, they followed their own hearts, their own desires. And if you think about how and where your heart has probably led you at times, that's not necessarily a good thing. Well, the last of the judges actually comes up in the book of Samuel. Now, you'll see here it says 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then we have 1st and 2nd Kings. I just want to point out that that's how it appears in our Bibles today, but they were actually single books. First and Second Samuel is one book. So why is it divided into two in our Bibles? Because there was only so much that would fit on a scroll. So the First Samuel is how much fit on the first scroll, and then Second Samuel is what fit on the second scroll. But we could just call this the book of Samuel. But for our Bibles, we use First and Second Samuel. And so we have the priest Samuel. And there's a great story at the very beginning of that tells us about his very faithful mother named Hannah. I like to give a shout out to the ladies whenever we can. Now I need to backtrack for just a moment because I almost forgot to mention Ruth. Now Ruth is not part of any of these stories, but she is, again, what Dr. Sid Buzzell would call a color book. So in this time of the Judges when things were going terribly, here we have the story of one woman in particular who was faithful to God and how it resulted for her and her family. And it's a beautiful love story. It's only 4 chapters. It's well worth checking out. But we get that story to say, you know what? It wasn't everybody, but there were a good many who did poorly during this time period. So now we've got Samuel, a priest. And towards the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, the people come to him and they ask if that God might give them a king. They want to be like all the other nations around them and have kings that'll lead them in battle when it's necessary. And Samuel's heart breaks because he knows that it was always intended that God would be the people's king and that they would follow God in their everyday life. He says this as much to God, and God says, you know what? Give them what they want, but warn them that there are a payment, if you will, for having a king. A king is going to tax them. A king is going to conscript their children into service. And so they're going to see that there are downfalls to having a king. But the people insist, and so Samuel will anoint the first of the kings, a man by the name of Saul. And so now we find ourselves in this first period of the monarchy, the United Monarchy, where Saul is the first king over all the tribes of Israel. Now, Saul looks like a king. He's head and shoulders taller than everybody else in the nation. He has a kingly bearing. But we see during the course of the stories that we find in 1 Samuel that he does not live up to God's expectations. He is not a man after God's own heart. And in fact, he's often impatient. He often does things that are outside of his scope of responsibility and even permission. And so God actually takes his blessing away from Saul and asks Samuel to instead anoint a new king who the nation will not recognize as a king for many years, but will be the king according to God, and that is David. And one of the big differences we see is just even in how they're anointed. When Samuel goes to David's father, Jesse, he has all the sons come, they come to a banquet, and all the sons are there. And Samuel looks at the first son, and he's like, oh, he looks like he'd be a great king. But God rejects him. He says, no, I'm not looking at the outward appearance, I'm looking at the heart. And one by one, God rejects all of the sons that are at the banquet. It's only when Samuel has gone to the last son that he turns to the father, Jesse, and says, is this it? And Jesse's like, well, there's David. He's out in the field. He's the runt of the litter. There's no expectation that he will be a great man, much less king. And so here we see that God, again, he looks at the heart. And in fact, David will be known as a man after God's own heart. But let's talk just one other thing. When we go back and look at Saul, again, remember, Saul looked like a king, but one of the ways in which that we see that he really did, in fact, fail is in the story of David and Goliath. When Goliath, the giant of the Philistines, comes out and challenges the armies of Israel and says, send one man out to me to fight me, and let's see who wins this particular battle. Saul, who's head and shoulders taller than everybody else, who looks like a great king, who should be leading his people and encouraging them, instead, he falls back in fear along with everybody else. And it will be David, the young runt, if you will, who will step up and face the giant. Now, David is not a perfect man, and we still call him a man after God's own heart. Even after the rape of Bathsheba, the murder of her husband Uriah, The reason being, why do we call him a man after God's own heart but not Saul when they both done things that were bad? Well, David recognized his sin and he repented, and he called upon God for forgiveness. He recognizes that he's not done what he should, but he calls upon God for forgiveness and seeks to live once more after God's own heart. Now, he will still have to pay the consequences, and we see quite a bit of drama in the end of 2 Samuel as the story of his time on the throne comes to an end. But ultimately, he will be followed by his son, Solomon. Solomon starts off very favorably. When God says, I will give you anything that you ask for, Solomon asks for wisdom so that he will know how to lead God's people. It is he also who will then build the temple. Now, once before, we had the tabernacle. That was, again, the traveling worship place, and the place where God's throne, the Ark of the Covenant, was located so that God could live among God's people. Well, the tabernacle still exists, but now that they've established Jerusalem, and so we should probably list Jerusalem, we can find it on our maps. There we go. Now, Solomon, first David wanted to, and Solomon is allowed to, build a temple for God. Now I'm going to put the word first next to it, because we're going to find ultimately that there are going to be more than one temple. Okay? And so Solomon builds the temple, and everything seems to go really well. People from all over the world, the Queen of Sheba comes up. They all want to see and hear Solomon's wisdom. Well, the other thing that happens is that Solomon also makes treaties with a number of nations, and a lot of times these treaties involve marrying a noblewoman or a princess from these other countries. Ultimately, Solomon ends up with 300 wives and 700 concubines. Now, we saw earlier that Jacob having 2 wives was a problem. This just exacerbates the problem. And what we find is that as Solomon marries these women, instead of insisting that they need to worship the one true God of Israel, he allows them to continue to worship the gods that they bring with them, and in fact builds shrines for them to worship their gods, and worships the gods along with his wives. And so his heart is torn between the one true God and all of these idols that his wives and concubines bring with him. And so his reign doesn't end particularly well. When he does die, his son Rehoboam, and I didn't put Rehoboam's name up here. I can go ahead and list it so you can see the spelling. Rehoboam. Whoops. Sorry, I'm going to put him down here where he belongs. Rehoboam comes to the throne, and the people of Israel come to him and say, you know, as your father did all these building projects. He built the temple, he built palaces, he built these shrines, he did a lot of infrastructure work, if you will, and as a result, he taxed us heavily, and he pulled us into conscription in order to do these building projects. They come to Rehoboam and say, give us a break. So Rehoboam turns to his dad's advisors, and the advisors say, yes, give them a break, and they will love you forever. Then Rehoboam goes to what I call his frat buddies, his own friends of his own age, and they say, no, you got to show them who you are. You need to show them that you're even tougher than your dad. Really stick it to them. And that's what Rehoboam does. As a result, the 10 tribes in the northern part of the country say, that's it, we are done with you. You can be king of whatever you want, but it's not going to be of us. And so they secede from the nation. Now, amazingly enough, they keep the name of the kingdom of Israel, and they're what we call the northern kingdom of Israel. Their first king is a man by the name of Jeroboam. Jeroboam had actually worked for Solomon in building the temple, had fallen out of favor, and then God had said, if you listen to me, I will put you in a leadership role. And so Jeroboam is afraid that the people will ultimately go back to one nation and he would be dethroned as king if they return to Jerusalem, where the temple is, in order to worship. And so he builds 2 idols two golden calves and puts them in different places in the northern kingdom, one in Dan and one in Samaria. And you might have heard that name before. And so we start to see a decline. Now, each of these kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel, which is made of the 10 tribes that are located in the north, and the southern kingdom of Judah. This is made up of the tribe of Judah and the Benjamite tribe, which is basically landlocked in Judah and probably didn't have much of a choice. So we have 10 tribes to the north, that makes up Israel, 2 tribes to the south, that makes up Judah. And each over the next hundreds of years will have a succession of kings. In the north, we'll have anywhere from about like 19 kings, and each one of them will be listed as bad when we look at the scripture. Among them include some of the worst, and you probably remember these names, Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab is known as one of the worst kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. But what's interesting is if we look at the record of what he does as a king, politically he's very astute and he's very successful. So why is he called a bad king? Because the appellation good or bad has nothing to do with their ability and their success in political stand, but rather in whether or not they obey God. And so a bad king doesn't obey God. And Ahab is one of the worst, and his wife Jezebel, who brings with her all of the idols and false gods of her own nation, is even worse. Well, this is also the period, and we've started to see it. Samuel was probably the first. We called him a priest, but he could also be called a prophet. And later on, when we talk about David, there's the prophet Nathan. I'm going to add his name in here just for giggles. But what we start to see that as the kings appear, God also brings into their midst prophets, messengers of God, who are meant to help them stay on the straight and narrow and to obey and follow God's desires. And they do so with different success. One of the most famous, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel, is Elijah. And he specifically is a big part of the story as we look at the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Along with him, his successor Elisha is another. And if you're looking at your paper copy handout, you'll notice that above this first row of books, there are a number of books of prophets. And they are in order as best as we can figure them out, as best as we can put them in the timeline, accordingly to where they should fit on the timeline down here. So you can see the prophets that were during this divided kingdom and so on. In the south, we have others, including Isaiah, who actually sort of works with both the northern and southern kingdom. But ultimately what's going to happen is that the northern kingdom, all of the kings are known as bad. All of them. Not a one of them follows God. And so God allows them to be judged. If they're not going to follow, not just the kings, but the people themselves, if they're not going to follow God, then why should they be called God's people? This was part of the covenant that God made. That I will be your God and you will be my people. You will follow me. You will follow my ways. The northern kingdom of Israel doesn't do that. And as a result, they are allowed to be destroyed by the empire of the Assyrians. Assyria. Now, Assyria was a large empire of that time. It was north and to the east of the land of Canaan. You can see that on your maps. You might want to mark that. And the Assyrians had a way of dealing with conquered peoples. And what they would do is they would come in, they basically scoop up pretty much all the people that were there, and they would scatter them throughout the rest of their kingdom. The idea was that they would separate their people from others of their kind, so there were only a few who shared the same language and custom and cultures, and they would be mixed with other people with other languages, customs, and cultures, and thereby it would reduce the chance of revolt. And they would take people from other parts of their kingdom and their empire and move them into the land that was conquered. This is where we're going to start to begin to see the beginnings of what we will eventually call the Samaritans in the New Testament. So this is a pivotal point in the story. Now, the northern kingdom no longer exists. All we have left is the southern kingdom. Now, among the kings that are named as kings of the southern kingdom, not all of them are bad, I'm glad to say. We have some examples of good kings, and that includes Josiah and Hezekiah, and there's one, Jehoshaphat. You know that name? It's actually the name of a king of the southern kingdom of Israel. Of all the kings, there's about 5 or 6 that are called good, who followed after God's will. And of course, they weren't perfect. They had times when they stumbled also. But it allows that kingdom to last just a little bit longer. But ultimately, to them comes the prophet Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet. And he points out that they've really just, even with some of the good kings, they haven't managed to keep their part of the covenant. And God is going to pronounce judgment on them as well. And so ultimately, about 100 years after the Assyrians have destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, and so we have the lost tribes of Israel, the 10, they get scattered throughout Assyria. Now, Babylon is going to come. This new empire is going to come. It has now since destroyed and taken over the Assyrian Empire. They're going to come in and destroy the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the Babylonians, unlike the Assyrians, have a different way of dealing with conquered peoples. What they do is that they come in waves, and they start exiling the people from their homeland to Babylon. They start with the creme de la creme, the political leaders, the young men of great intellect and handsomeness, and they take them to Babylon. And in Babylon, they are trained to work in the king's court. They're basically trained to become the ideal Babylonian citizen. They are meant to not keep their own culture necessarily, but to integrate as part of the larger empire. And they continue that in waves. And so there were 3 deportations of people from Judah, Jerusalem, over to Babylon. In this period, we see in the first wave, among those who are taken are Daniel and his friends, the ones that we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so the book of Daniel tells us about their experiences. Another one who occurs during this time period, he would go over in the second wave, would be the prophet Ezekiel. Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah are contemporaries. They pretty much live at the same time and talk back and forth to the people that God has called them to, and shares with the people that, yes, they have been sent into exile because they failed to live according to the covenant. But there is hope that God will bring them back, and God will no longer look at them as a people as a whole, but as individuals on whose hearts he will write the commandments and give them the ability to love the God on their own. The exile is going to take part for 70 years. That's what Jeremiah predicted. And we see that that is indeed the case. Now, what's interesting is that Jeremiah predicted not only would the exile last for 70 years, but the exile would end when the king Cyrus would allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Cyrus was not a Babylonian king. He was a Persian king. So near the end of the exile, the Persian Empire came in and conquered the Babylonian Empire, took all the lands, took all the peoples, and when Cyrus is shown this prophecy that he will allow them to go back, he says, sure, because they also have yet a different policy of how to deal with conquered peoples. And in their instance, they allow the people to maintain their language, their custom, their cultures, even stay in their land, but they will have to pay taxes to the empire. And that's exactly what happens. Now, the people come back. Now, not all of them come back. It's estimated that at least probably, I'm trying to remember the number, like 5 million people were exiled to Babylon. In the first wave of people who come back, there's only about 600,000, another 400,000. So there's really not a lot who come back. But among those who do come back, there are specific leaders that are worth mentioning. One of them that I did not have on your quiz, your pretest at the beginning, was a man by the name of Zerubbabel. What's interesting is he's one of the first governors, Persian governors, under the authority of the Persians, but he's a Jew. In fact, he comes from the line of David. If the exile had not happened, there's a good chance that he would have been one of the next kings by this point. And so it fits that continuation of the line. What we also see is the priest Ezra. The priest Ezra is very fundamental in helping the people to return to the practices of worship. For 70 years, they haven't been able to worship the way they used to because the temple has been destroyed. And so they have no longer a place to offer the sacrifices according to the law of Moses. And so Ezra is fundamental in helping them to reestablish their worship practice. This is where we see the second temple. The first temple was destroyed when the Babylonians finished their exile of the people to Babylon. And so when they come back to Jerusalem, to Judah, there's nothing there. They have to restart. The second temple, as built under Ezra and Zerubbabel, does not match the grandeur of the one built by Solomon. And the old men who have returned and remember it from their youth weep because it's just not the same. And yet, at the same time, they are now able to worship once again. This is also the time period in which we see Nehemiah. Nehemiah starts off as a cupbearer to the king, but when he hears those who return back to Babylon say that the walls still haven't been rebuilt around Jerusalem, that the people are still threatened and in danger of the neighboring peoples, he makes a request, and the king at that time allows him to go back, gives him the materials to go back and rebuild the walls. And so we see that. Now, we still have two other names that were on our pretest that we haven't put up on the board. The first one that I want to look at is Esther. Now, Esther is not a book that we have listed up here, and in fact, I need to go ahead and put these names back in. This is the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But many of you are familiar that there is, in fact, also a book of Esther. Esther takes place about the same time, shortly after. But she is what Dr. Bazel would call a color book. And what this book says is that there were Jews who never returned to Jerusalem. They continued to live in the lands where they had been sent. In this case, Esther and her uncle Mordecai live in a capital city of Susa, with a king there, and the story evolves to say how they managed to survive and thrive in this foreign community. Now, we still also have additional prophets that we can see above on our paper copies of this timeline, and there are prophets that continue to speak to the people even after the exile as they come back to Jerusalem, always pointing them back to the time and the day when a Savior is going to come, the one who will restore all of this, who will be the blessing to the nations that was the third and final part of the covenant with Abraham. So before we finish at this time, one more person I want to name, Job. In all of this story, we haven't included Job. Job is another one of these color books. And Job actually is considered to be a contemporary of Abraham. We don't know where Job lives necessarily, but the story tells us of a man who is faithful to God and who has been blessed abundantly. But when Satan comes and says he's only following you because of the blessings, God allows Satan a certain leeway to take away some of those blessings and see how Job will respond. And in the course of all of the text in between, ultimately we find out that Job continues to worship God despite his circumstances, trusting in the one true God, just as we are called to trust even when we don't see the results, the blessings that we may be hoping for. In all of this, over and over again, we see that the people are blessed and given opportunity to continue to trust and worship in God. When they fail to trust and worship in God, God allows others to come and oppress them, to take away their freedoms. We see this in the exile. We see this during the period of the judges. But ultimately, God always returns when the people call out to God for help, to rely on God and God alone. You and I have that opportunity every single day to trust God despite the circumstances that we might find ourselves in. Maybe, like Job, we'll find that blessings are taken away, family, possessions, land. And yet, do we still trust God even in the midst of those troubling times? Or when we are fully blessed, like the Israelites, going in and taking possession of the land of Canaan, living in homes that they themselves did not um, build, and enjoying wells that they themselves did not dig, and the orchards and farms that they did not plant themselves. Do we keep our eyes when life is going well? Do we keep our eyes on God? Do we continue to follow God's will? Or do we fall into this idea that we're doing fine on our own, we don't need God, only to suffer as a result? Over and over, God seeks to live among God's people, whether it's in the tabernacle, whether it's in the temple, first or second, or in our hearts, as we know today. God always wants to live with us, wants to be in relationship with us. Do we seek out God the same way that God seeks out us? Have a blessed day, and I hope you will join us for our second session, which will be the intertestamental period through the Gospels.